Unit 3, Scientific Method and Knowledge Generation. It has been estimated that knowledge almost doubles after every 80 years. You may wonder why it is so, and how it happens. In fact, human curiosity is the main reason for the increase in knowledge. This knowledge is what may be called human commonwealth. It knows no boundaries. People from all countries use this commonwealth and contribute to it. The present age has rightly been called the age of knowledge. Knowledge generation is today as important as communicating it and helping others construct it for themselves. Research in social sciences in general, and in counseling and family therapy in particular, is a scientific process of generating knowledge. Human beings have been generating knowledge from the dawn of civilization on the basis of their life experiences, teachings from authority, influences from customs, traditions, and socializing agents like educational institutions. Generating knowledge or discovering truth has also been largely possible by the use of deductive and inductive reasoning. Looking into the limitations of these two processes of reasoning, scholars integrated the most important aspects of deductive and inductive methods, shaping out the scientific method or approach to knowledge generation. This has been the fundamental approach to research and hence to the generation of knowledge. In this unit, we shall look into the sources of knowledge generation and the scientific method. Objectives. After studying this unit, you will be able to discuss various sources of knowledge, differentiate between knowledge generation through inductive and deductive modes of reasoning, explain the meaning of the scientific method, justify the scientific method as a more scientific mode of knowledge than other modes, and understand the positivistic paradigm and the emergence of field methods. 3.2 Knowledge, Nature and Types. 3.2.1 What is knowledge? It is not easy to define knowledge. Most dictionary definitions of knowledge do not do justice to the concept of knowledge. The word knowledge has been derived from the verb to know. Loosely defined, knowledge consists of all that a person knows and believes to be true. This would be called personal knowledge. Personal knowledge differs from one person to another. This is because much of one's personal knowledge may be unexamined, untested, and therefore subjective. In the context of research, when we use the word knowledge, we refer to scientific knowledge. Scientific knowledge is well tried out, examined and tested, i.e., validated knowledge. It is scientific knowledge which is considered and accepted by experts to be true. Knowledge, in this sense, represents the entire content of our intellectual heritage. In spite of what has been said above, we should remember that the concept of knowledge expresses our standards, ideals, and tastes about the rightful exercise of cognitive skills, because collectively they express our conceptions of truth and evidence. Knowledge is, therefore, concerned with how we come to know, what are our approved standards of competence in performance, in inquiry, and in criticism. The concept of knowledge has been associated with what are called philosophical traditions. These are primarily three: the rationalistic, the empirical, and the pragmatic. Rationalistic tradition. According to the rationalistic tradition, knowledge is derived through deductive reasoning based on self-evident basic truths. Knowledge, according to rationalists, does not strictly depend upon experience. It depends instead on reasoning. Rationalists consider mathematics to be the ideal science. Mathematicians do not conduct experiments and surveys. Yet through reasoning, they arrive at truth that does not depend on experience for its confirmation. Empirical tradition. According to the empirical tradition, all natural phenomena can be known only through experience and not through deductive reasoning or intuition. Empiricists assume that our mind has the power to compare, combine, analyze, and generalize upon whatever is provided to it by experience. They also believe that the mind possesses the ability to perform logical operations upon concepts. The empirical tradition emphasizes learning from experience through accurate observation, reason-based generalization, and willingness to revise laws that are not supported by events related to a particular phenomenon. Pragmatic tradition. The pragmatic tradition emphasizes the experimental character of the process of acquiring knowledge. The pragmatic tradition stresses that merely carrying out logical operations on basic truths is not enough. One needs to go beyond the generalization about observed phenomena. Pragmatists are in favor of experimentation based on controlled observation of the environment and events. The process of generating and testing knowledge is, according to Dewey, the process of trying and undergoing. Trying an idea in practice and learning from observation of the consequences of the trial. Pragmatists are of the view that the mind has the capacity for active generation of ideas so that the problem faced by the individual can be resolved. Pragmatists are in favor of active and imaginative theorizing provided it leads to experimentation. The outcomes of the experimentation should give direction to imaginative theorizing. 3.2.2 Types of knowledge. Declarative knowledge. According to Biggs, 1999, knowledge is of many kinds. Chief among these is declarative or propositional knowledge. This knowledge refers to knowing about things or knowing what. Declarative knowledge is generated by research. It is not solely based on one's personal experience. Our knowledge about the solar system, about how different seasons are formed, how children learn, how humans process information, all these and much more are part of declarative knowledge. It is also known as public knowledge because it is tested through rules of evidence that make it verifiable, replicable, and logically consistent. Functional knowledge. Functional knowledge is concerned with how to do things, and it involves performance based on understanding. Functional knowledge is strongly rooted in declarative knowledge. Unless one is strong in declarative knowledge and understands what actions can be performed through it, it cannot become functional knowledge. In other words, declarative knowledge, when put to use for problem solving or for performing theory-based tasks, becomes functional knowledge. Procedural knowledge. Then comes procedural knowledge, which is essentially skill-based. It, however, does not have the high rigor of declarative knowledge. Procedural knowledge goes hand in hand with appropriate competencies in a particular area. Procedural knowledge is largely based on the performance of the right action in the correct sequence. Conditional knowledge. There is yet another type of knowledge, viz. Conditional knowledge, which is a combination of both procedural and higher-level declarative knowledge. It informs us of what one should do under given circumstances, why, and under what conditions one should do this and not that. Not our 3.3 sources of knowledge. A person needs knowledge and generates it for the purpose of her or his life activities. Without going into the theory of knowledge, epistemology, it may be considered that what we call knowledge is the product of knowing, perceiving, thinking, guessing, being mistaken, remembering, finding out, inferring, proving, reflecting, imagining, and so on. Knowledge may be in the form of fact, belief, or judgment. A fact is anything that exists or can be conceived of. What we claim to know is belief or judgment. Human knowledge takes the form of belief or judgment about a particular phenomenon. Some beliefs may be supported by evidence. Others may be based on our perceptions and experiences. The beliefs which are supported by evidence are called justified beliefs. Only justified beliefs are knowledge. Knowledge includes what we know about matters of fact as well as the principles and processes of inference. It has three elements. There is a system of ideas. The ideas correspond to things actually existing, and there is belief in such correspondence. If we look at the historical perspective, it will be evident that efforts of centuries were required by human beings to improve their capacity and readiness to obtain reliable knowledge. To gain some insight into the tortuous pathway traversed for this purpose, the following discussion briefly examines the various sources of knowledge that persons draw upon to solve problems. These are 1. Life experiences, 2. Authority, 3. Customs and traditions, 4. Deductive reasoning, 5. Inductive reasoning, 6. Scientific method. 3.3.1 Life experiences. In order to conduct life activities satisfactorily and successfully, a person has to understand her or his environment and the nature of phenomena it presents to her or his senses. Otherwise, she or he can hardly hope to solve the problems she or he faces constantly. One of the means by which we seek the answers to our problems is our life experiences. Perhaps the most primitive, and yet the most fundamental source of the solution to a problem lies in personal experiences. Thus, confronted with a sudden flow of water down a ravine, a prehistoric person could have solved her or his problem and saved her or his life if she or he had only remembered that water does not generally stay on hills. On an elementary level, she or he had the knowledge of a basic scientific fact, that water runs downhill. In ancient times, nomads and various tribes from their personal experience probably remembered that certain wild fruits always made them ill, that grains ripen at particular times of the year, and that sudden floods in the rivers during the rainy season were due to the fact that water does not generally stay on hills. A young man can repair a puncture in a bicycle inner tube because he has done it several times previously. People may thus draw upon their own individually accumulated body of knowledge and skills derived from encounters and acquaintance with facts and events in their environment. However, one has to keep in mind the limitations of personal experiences as a source of knowledge. Although experience is a familiar and well-used source of knowledge, it still may be inappropriate for new problems. Also, an uncritical use of personal experience may lead to erroneous conclusions. People may make errors when observing or reporting what they have seen or done. They may omit evidence that does not agree with their opinion, use measuring instruments that entail many subjective estimates, establish a belief on insufficient evidence, fail to observe significant factors relating to a specific situation, or draw improper conclusions or inferences owing to personal prejudices. In general, it may be observed that how one is affected by an event depends upon who the one is. Two persons will have very different experiences in the same situations. For instance, two supervisors observing the same classroom at the same time could truthfully compile very different reports if one focused on and reported the things that went right and the other focused on and recounted the things that went wrong. Similarly, inferences drawn by different members of a family are different depending upon their individual experiences, attachments, perceptions, etc. 3.32 Authority. Seeking and accepting the explanation of authorities is a well-established method of getting knowledge and solving problems encountered in the environment. When one has not had personal experience with a phenomenon, the obvious recourse is to consult their parents, their teachers, or even their older siblings for answers to problems with which they are not familiar. Rather than attempting to determine truth independently, people often seek the advice of experts who, because of their intellect, training, experience, or aptitudes, are better informed than other people. Experts are necessary in a complicated culture such as ours, where knowledge is expanding so rapidly that no one can be an expert at everything. And obviously, certain individuals have such wide experience and deep insight that their advice can be of immense benefit. But it should never be forgotten that as sources of knowledge, authorities have limitations. Authorities cannot be infallible. They may at times be in disagreement among themselves on issues. This shows that their authoritative statements are nothing but personal opinions and not facts. We should, therefore, check their agreements and evidence upon which they base their claims to knowledge. Accepting experts' opinions unconditionally, thus, may at times lead us to untruth rather than knowledge. In some familial issues, the advice of the elders helps to resolve disputes. 3.3.3 Customs and Traditions. It goes without saying that customs and traditions serve as sources of knowledge for the members of a particular society and culture. They depend on customs and traditions for answers to many questions related to their professional and everyday problems. People usually and readily accept customary modes of dress, speech, food, worship, and etiquette. In practical life, this automatic acceptance of approved patterns of behavior is often necessary because one cannot question all things. But the limitations of customs and traditions as sources of knowledge should not be lost sight of. One should not make the mistake of assuming that everything that has customarily been done is right, or that an appeal to the accumulated knowledge and wisdom of ages will always lead to the truth. NASTAR 3.4 Deductive Reasoning. Reasoning is inherently a thinking process. Human beings have recourse to reasoning in order to obtain reliable knowledge. They attempt to comprehend the world around them by applying the faculty of reasoning. There are two types of reasoning, deductive and inductive. Deductive reasoning can be considered as a thinking process in which one proceeds from general to specific statements through logical arguments. Aristotle's syllogism, deductive reasoning, is based on the syllogism, which was the great contribution of the Greek philosopher Aristotle to formal logic. In its simplest form, the syllogism consists of a major premise based on an a priori or self-evident proposition, a minor premise providing a particular instance, and a conclusion. To use a simple example, consider the following proposition. All planets orbit the Sun, major premise. The Earth is a planet, minor premise. Therefore, the Earth orbits the Sun, conclusion. The assumption underlying the syllogism is that through a sequence of formal steps of logic, from the general to the particular, a valid conclusion can be deduced from a valid premise. In personal and professional life, we very often use deductive logic in solving problems. Lawyers, doctors, soldiers, and detectives often resort to deductive arguments in their professional work. Research workers have been invariably using deductive reasoning to carry out certain tasks of their research work. Without deduction, facts obtained through observation and experiment would be fruitless, since one could not fit them into deductive systems called sciences. Limitations of deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning has obviously its own limitations. Deductive conclusions depend upon pre-existing knowledge. It does not enable scholars to gain new knowledge or to make new discoveries. Deductive reasoning stresses only the forms of argument and not on the truth or falsity of the statements. According to the deductive mode of reasoning, if the form of the argument is sound, then even a false premise will not matter. Of course, this does not mean that deductive reasoning has no role in the knowledge generation process. Rather, it has its own use in formulating and proposing hypotheses from general truth, theory. This helps knowledge generation through inquiry by the use of hypothesizing. Deductive reasoning can systematize what is already known and can identify new relationships as one proceeds from the known to the unknown, but it cannot be relied upon as a self-sufficient method for securing reliable knowledge. Deductive versus inductive reasoning. In deductive reasoning, we start with a generalization and apply it to a specific case and deduce an inference. In inductive reasoning, we start with a specific event, make many more observations, and on the basis of the commonality in a given set of observations, we formulate a generalization. Thus, while in deductive reasoning we start with a generalization and apply it to a specific instance, in inductive reasoning we proceed in the reverse order. We start with a particular event or instance and conclude with a generalization. General, specific, deductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning, Fig 3.1, deductive and inductive reasoning. Let us now understand inductive reasoning as a source of knowledge in greater detail. 3.3.5 Inductive reasoning. We know that the conclusions reached by deductive reasoning are true only if they are derived from true premises. But the question is how to determine whether the premises are true. Inductive reasoning has been devised to complement deductive reasoning as a means of searching for knowledge. Particular instances, concrete facts, are observed in inductive reasoning, and by examining these particular instances, a general conclusion is established about the whole class to which these particular instances belong. These general conclusions, arrived at through induction, may be used as a major premise for deductive inferences. Baconian induction. In the early 1600s, Francis Bacon introduced the mode of inductive reasoning. He felt strongly that the deductive mode of reasoning could never suffice for the discovery of truth, because it started with a preconceived notion, and therefore biased the results obtained. He declared that if one collected enough data without any preconceived idea about their significance and orientation, one could maintain complete objectivity about the process. Then, Bacon held, it was most likely that an inherent relationship would emerge. There may be two forms of induction, perfect and imperfect. Perfect induction establishes a conclusion by an exhaustive enumeration of all instances that are subsumable under a given class. All India census operations are an example. Imperfect induction arrives at a generalization by observing only some instances, an adequate and representative sample from the entire class. Researchers in social sciences utilize imperfect induction more often than perfect induction for in most investigations it may not be possible to examine all the instances to which a conclusion refers. Bacon's contribution to scientific progress is significant. He realized that the advancement of knowledge was not possible only through the deductive method. Increasing stress was to be laid on the observational basis of science. Bacon directed the attention of scientists to nature for solutions to people's problems, demanding empirical evidence for verification. Logic and authority in themselves were no longer regarded as conclusive means of proof, and instead became sources of hypotheses about the world and its phenomena. Limitations of inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning has inherent limitations. Just as in the case of deductive reasoning, inductive reasoning also, only by itself, does not lead to much advancement of knowledge. Its basic limitation is that it can be applied to only as many events as can be observed, and hence the conclusions arrived at cannot really be infallible. The conclusions reached by imperfect inductive reasoning do contain information that is not present, even implicitly, in one of the premises, the observed instances. If all the premises, observed instances, are true, the probability of conclusions arrived at may be of varying degrees. 334 Scientific Method. Francis Bacon planted the seeds of the modern scientific method of acquiring knowledge. He recommended that investigators reach conclusions on the basis of observed facts. In order to construct a more practical method of attaining reliable knowledge, scholars like Newton, Galileo, and their successors eventually combined the deductive and inductive thought processes. This synthesis of reason and observation gave rise to the modern scientific method of generating knowledge. The 3.4.1 Defining Scientific Method. The most distinctive feature of science is its empirical nature. The next most important characteristic is its set of procedures, which show not only how findings have been arrived at, but are sufficiently clear for others who are interested to repeat them. That is, to check them out with the same or other materials and thereby test the result. A scientific approach necessarily involves standards and procedures for demonstrating the empirical warrant of its findings, showing the match or fit between its statements and what is happening or has happened in the world. These standards and procedures, taken together, form the scientific method. Thus, the scientific method is the way in which one can test opinions, impressions, or guesses by examining the available evidence both for and against. It is simply the pursuit of truth, which is determined by logical considerations. We see that the scientific method aims at discovering facts, but facts cannot be discovered without some reflective thinking and inquiry. When using the scientific method, we engage in a thinking process called reflective thinking. Every fact is initially nothing but some proposition or problem. John Dewey, in How We Think, analyzed the stages of the activity involved in the process of reflective thinking in the following 5 steps. 1. A felt difficulty, when one encounters a puzzling experience or problem. 2. Location and definition of the difficulty, when one makes observations, gathers facts to specify the difficulty more concretely and precisely. 3. Suggested solutions of the problem or hypothesizing, when one, after a preliminary study of the facts about the problem, makes intelligent guesses about the possible solutions of the problem, which are called hypotheses. 4. Deductive reasoning. One formulates the consequences of the suggested solutions, hypotheses. 5. Testing the hypotheses, when one makes observations or collects evidence to confirm or disconfirm the hypotheses. Here is how Curlinger gives a graphic description of the above stages of the scientific method. First, there is a doubt, a barrier, an indeterminate situation crying out, so to speak, to be made determinate. The scientist experiences vague doubts, emotional disturbances, incoherent ideas. He struggles to formulate the problem, even if inadequately. He studies the literature, scans his own experience and the experience of others. Often, he simply has to wait for an inventive leap of mind. Maybe it will occur, maybe not. With the problem formulated, with the basic question or questions properly asked, the rest is much easier. Then the hypothesis is constructed, after which its implications are deduced. In this process, the original problem, and of course the original hypothesis, may be changed. It may be broadened or narrowed. It may even be abandoned. Last but not final, the relation expressed by the hypothesis is tested by observation and experimentation. On the basis of the research evidence, the hypothesis is accepted or rejected. This information is then fed back to the original problem, and it is kept or altered as dictated by the evidence. What is important to note is the overall fundamental idea of the scientific method as a controlled, rational process of reflective inquiry, the interdependent nature of the parts of the process, and the paramount importance of the problem and its statement. SART 3.42 Scientific Method combines induction and deduction. The steps in the act of reflective thinking, as delineated in the previous section, reveal how induction and deduction serve as opposing processes of the total problem-solving act. Induction provides the groundwork for hypotheses, and deduction explores the logical consequences of the hypotheses in order to eliminate those that are inconsistent with facts, while induction again contributes to the verification of the remaining hypotheses. Thus, in an investigation, one continually shifts between collecting facts, making generalizations, hypotheses to explain facts, deducing the consequences of one's hypotheses, and seeking additional facts to test the hypotheses. By combining both induction and deduction, one is able to arrive at reliable knowledge. It must be borne in mind that these steps of the scientific method do not provide a rigid pattern into which scientists must mold their thinking, for thinking cannot simply be scheduled. Investigators rarely follow a prescribed sequence of procedures. Knowledge generation is often a confused, floundering process, rather than a well-shaped, logical, orderly one. In an investigation, one does not tackle one step at a time, complete that process, and then move on to the next step. One may tackle the steps out of order, shuffle back and forth between steps, or work on two steps more or less simultaneously. Some steps may require little effort. Other steps may take a disproportionate amount of time and effort. What is most important to remember is that the scientific method is characterized by an inherent logic of its steps and procedures, which enables an investigator to pin their faith on it as a reliable tool for attaining truth and generating knowledge. Scientific method. The scientific method was formulated in order to avoid the defects of deductive reasoning as well as inductive reasoning. The scientific method is the method of research. Despite the variety, research has a typical set of procedures based on the scientific method, which is also known as the hypothetico-deductive paradigm. According to researchers, the scientific method consists of the following sequence of steps, see Fig. 4.2. 1. A theory exists about the phenomenon. 2. The researcher identifies and researches questions in the context of the problem. 3. The researcher formulates a research hypothesis based on the theory. The research hypothesis is a statement of the possible relationship between two or more variables, and it is testable. 4. The researcher describes the specific procedures, i.e., operations, by which the variables are defined and action is performed on them. The researcher formulates a null hypothesis on the research hypothesis, which can be tested statistically. They develop an appropriate research design, a plan of action for testing the null hypothesis. 5. The researcher conducts the study according to the research design and collects the data. Sum 6. The null hypothesis is tested by the researcher using the data collected through the study. The null hypothesis may be rejected or accepted based on statistical testing. If the null hypothesis is accepted, the theory is confirmed. If the null hypothesis is rejected, then the research hypothesis may have to be reformulated and tested again in order to solve the research problem. For this, steps 2 to 7 are repeated. Flowchart on using the scientific method. 1. A theory of the phenomenon exists. 2. A research problem is identified. Based on the theory, a testable research hypothesis is framed. 4 variables are operationalized and a research study is designed. 5. Research study is carried out and data are collected. 6. Research hypothesis is put in the null form and tested. Theory is confirmed. Another hypothesis, modified original hypothesis, is framed. Modified hypothesis is accepted. Theory is modified. Fig. 4.2, so flowchart on using the scientific method. This version. Limitations of scientific method. It has to be appreciated that the scientific method does not consist merely of the application of the steps such as problem definition, hypothesizing, collection of evidence, inferring and testing or verifying, but certain other factors like intuition, imagination, and chance have an undeniable role to play in any process of inquiry. In the history of scientific inquiry, there is no dearth of examples to support this view. In respect of methodology for explorations of fields yet unknown, the limitation of the scientific method becomes obvious if one recognizes that it represents only a reconstructed logic, and not logic in use, as far as scientific explorations are concerned. According to Kaplan, a reconstructed logic is not a description, but rather an idealization of scientific practice. Not even the greatest of scientists has a cognitive style that is wholly and perfectly logical, and the most brilliant piece of research still betrays its all-too-human nature. The logic in use is embedded in a matrix of logic in use, and even an illogic in use. The reconstruction idealizes the logic of science. Another argument made in adopting the scientific method is that it is only the outcome of applying the scientific method that can be considered as valid knowledge regarding the educational phenomenon. This methodological orthodoxy obviously raises more fundamental epistemological questions as to the role of empirical facts and experiences as tools of acquiring knowledge. Perhaps an educational researcher needs to examine the underlying assumptions before wedding himself to the method he adopts. This is because the interpretation that a researcher would provide, even for his empirical findings, depends finally upon the philosophical and ideological position he takes. One cannot but observe that the situation presents a misconstrued notion that the law of the scientific method has already been formulated, and it remains for the researcher only to pick out a problem and apply it. This tendency puts a serious methodological limitation on educational research. It encourages a view in which new methods or new ways of doing research would invariably be looked at with suspicion and hostility. Eventually, it blocks attempts to create and invent new methods and techniques which become necessary with the recognition of the fact that educational problems intrinsically vary from other fields of study, such as physical and natural sciences. The 3.5 Positivistic Paradigm. In order to explicate the positivistic paradigm, we have first to understand what a paradigm is. This term was introduced in 1962 by Thomas Kuhn in his book The Structure of Scientific Revolution. The concept has turned out to be useful in inspiring critical thinking about sciences and the way shifts in basic scientific thinking occur. A paradigm determines the criteria according to which one selects and defines problems for inquiry. A paradigm determines scientific approaches and procedures which stand out as exemplary to a new generation of scientists, as long as they do not oppose it. Kuhn characterizes a paradigm as an integrated cluster of substantive concepts, variables, and problems attached with corresponding methodological approaches and tools. A paradigm gathers into itself a community of investigators. By sharing information within itself, this community gives itself intellectual and social support. It tends not to communicate with investigators who follow different paradigms. Citation of others' work is frequent within a paradigm, but much less frequent, perhaps non-existent, across paradigms. Hence, the followers of a paradigm tend to have their own journals, scientific societies, and meetings, because the paradigm has won their allegiance to an integrated set of concepts, variables, problems, and methods. A revolution in the world of scientific paradigms occurs when one or several researchers at a given time encounter anomalies, for instance, make observations and reason as means of understanding behavior. More simply, explanation proceeded by way of scientific description. It was Comte who consciously invented the new science of society and gave it the name sociology. He thought that it would be possible to establish it on a positive basis, just like the other sciences, which served as necessary preliminaries to it. For social phenomena were to be viewed in the light of physiological or biological laws and theories, and investigated empirically, just like physical phenomena. Likewise, biological phenomena were to be viewed in the light of chemical laws and theories, and so on down the line. Comte's position was to lead to a general doctrine of positivism, which held that all genuine knowledge is based on sense experience and can only be advanced by means of observation and experiment. Following in the empiricist tradition, it limited inquiry and belief to what can be firmly established, thus abandoning metaphysical and speculative attempts to gain knowledge by reason alone. The positivist paradigm developed what has been described as a tough-minded orientation to facts and natural phenomena. 3.5.1 Aspects of Positivistic Paradigm. The positivistic paradigm has been defined in the last section, but its special features need to be explained. These are as follows. Difficulty in precise meaning. Not only Comte, but also many other scholars such as Bacon, Mill, and Hume, as well as the scholars of the Vienna Circle, contributed to the development of the concept of the positivistic paradigm. It is, therefore, difficult to assign it a very precise and consistent meaning. The term has also been applied to the doctrine of a school of philosophy known as logical positivism, originated by the scholars of the Vienna Circle. Logical positivists hold that the meaning of a statement is, or is given by, the method of its verification. Unverifiable statements are, therefore, meaningless. Assumption behind positivistic paradigm. Positivism derives its meaning from an acceptance of natural science as the paradigm of human knowledge. This has led to the development of the scientific method as a means of knowledge generation. The positivistic paradigm is, therefore, to be understood within the total framework of the principles and assumptions of science. First, there is the assumption of determinism, according to which events have causes and are determined by other circumstances. These causal links can eventually be uncovered and understood, and that the events are explicable in terms of their antecedents. The universe does not behave capriciously. It is the ultimate aim of the scientists to formulate laws to account for the happenings in the world around them, obtaining hereby a firm basis for prediction and control. The second assumption is that of empiricism, which holds that certain kinds of reliable knowledge can only originate in experience, which scientifically means that acceptance of a theory or hypothesis depends on the nature of empirical evidence for its support. Empirical here means that which is verifiable by observation. The viewpoint on empiricism may be summed up by saying that the best way to acquire reliable knowledge is the way of evidence obtained by direct experience. Thus, in an empirical science, the scientist first gathers data on the basis of experience. Then he classifies, or if possible, quantifies data, tries to discover relationships in the classified and quantified data, and ultimately, by gradual approximation, he reaches the truth. The third assumption, underlying the work of the scientist, is the principle of parsimony, the basic idea behind which is that phenomena should always be explained in the most economical way possible. The fourth assumption is that of generality, which forms the essential aspect of both the deductive and inductive methods of reasoning. Indeed, historically speaking, it was the problematic relationship between the concrete particular and the abstract general that results in two competing theories of knowledge, the rational and empirical. Beginning with observations of the particular, scientists set out to generalize their findings to the world at large. This is so because they are concerned ultimately with explanation. Of course, the concept of generality presents much less of a problem to natural scientists working chiefly with inanimate matter than to human scientists who, having to deal with samples of larger human populations, have to exercise great caution when generalizing their findings to the particular parent populations. Having identified the basic assumptions of science, we come to the core question: what is science? Science may be broadly defined as a way of comprehending the world, as a means of explanation and understanding, of prediction and control. Science is based on certain beliefs and assumptions which are briefly stated as under: all events in nature are, at least to a degree, lawful and ordered, predictable and regular. This order, predictability and regularity of nature can be discovered through the activities of the scientific method. Truth can ultimately be derived only from observation. Science does not depend upon authority as a source of truth, but relies upon empirical observation. Thus, the phenomena that can actually be observed to exist are within the domain of the scientific method. The ultimate goal of science is to integrate and systematize findings into a meaningful pattern or theory, which is regarded as tentative and not the ultimate truth. Theory is subject to revision or modification as new evidence is found. Knowledge generation under positivistic paradigm. The positivistic paradigm has systematized the knowledge generation process, which proceeds as the development of a science. An area or a set of phenomena is brought under study or close scrutiny. Then the relevant factors and variables are identified. Research or study correlates the variables and parameters which may be found to be related to one another. Information about the phenomena under study is systematically integrated as theories begin to develop. If needed, the researcher may move from correlation to causality through systematic and controlled manipulation of variables, experimentation. This leads to the establishment of a body of knowledge, theory, as the outcome of the study. Depending on the nature of the phenomena under scrutiny, laws may be formulated and systematized. Ultimately, the established body of knowledge is used according to necessity in the resolution of problems or as a source of further inquiry. 23.52 Limitations of Positivistic Paradigm. Scientific Method and Knowledge Generation. In spite of the scientific enterprise's proven success, especially in the field of natural sciences, its ontological, theory of being or of existence, and epistemological, theory of knowledge, bases have been the focus of sustained and sometimes vehement criticism. Beginning in the second half of the 19th century, the limitations of the positivistic paradigm were pointed out by the best intellectuals in Europe, that is, philosophers, scientists, social critics, and creative artists. And even today, opponents of positivism are made up of a similar cross-section, including many from within the ranks of the social scientists themselves. Essentially, it has been a reaction against the world picture projected by the positivistic paradigm, which, it is contended, devalues life and mind. The fundamental limitation of the positivistic paradigm is that it reflects a mechanistic and reductionist view of nature which, by definition, excludes notions of choice, freedom, individuality, and moral responsibility. To quote a critique, the positivistic paradigm, or for that matter the mechanistic science, eliminates the concept of life itself. All they can do is to define life in terms of biochemistry, biophysics, vibrations, wavelengths, and so on. They reduce life to conceivable measurement, but such a conception of life does not embrace the most evident element of all, that life can only be known by a living being, by inner experience. No matter how exact measurement may be, it can never give us an experience of life, for life cannot be weighed and measured on a physical scale. The Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, the proponent of existentialism, also pointed out the limitations of the positivistic paradigm. Kierkegaard was concerned with individuals and their need to fulfill themselves to the highest level of development. This realization of a person's potential was for him the meaning of existence. But the characteristic features of the age, that is, democracy's trust in the crowd mentality, the ascendancy of reason, scientific and technological progress, all militate against the achievement of this end and contribute to the dehumanization of the individual. Kierkegaard was convinced that people suffer from the illusion of objectivity, which is one of the main masts of the positivistic paradigm. He wished to free people from this illusion. By objectivity, he meant the imposition of rules of behavior and thought, and the making of a person into an observer who is set on discovering general laws governing human behavior. The capacity for subjectivity, he argued, should be regained. He regarded subjectivity as the ability to consider one's own relationship to whatever constitutes the focus of inquiry. The justification for any intellectual activity lies in the effect it has on increasing our awareness and degree of consciousness. This increase, some critics claim, has been retarded in our time by the excessive influence the positivistic paradigm has been allowed to exert on areas of our intellectual life. Thus, the positivistic paradigm demands that nothing must be regarded as real which cannot be founded by empirical science and rational methods by objectivity. Since the whole problem belongs to psychic reality, to man's inner world, to his moral being, and to the subjective life, there can be no debate unless we are prepared to recognize the serious limitations of the positivistic paradigm and the failure of strict adherence to objectivity to give an adequate account of existence. The theoretical perspective with which the positivistic paradigm has dominated the social science scene seeks the facts or causes of social phenomena with little regard for the subjective states of individuals. The positivist considers social facts or social phenomena as things that exercise an external and coercive influence on human behavior. The positivist searches for facts and causes through methods such as surveys, questionnaires, inventories, and demographic analysis, which produce quantitative data, and which allow him to statistically prove relationships between operationally defined variables. The positivist is not interested in the subjective nature of human behavior, and therefore reduces people to statistical aggregates. And these are no less serious limitations. Many critics of the positivistic paradigm question the perspective adopted by positivist social science because it presents a misleading picture of the human being. This biased and restricted image of humans comes about because the social scientists, wedded to positivism, concentrate on the repetitive, predictable, and invariant aspects of the person, on visible externalities to the exclusion of the subjective world. Another limitation of the positivistic paradigm is that it fails to take account of our unique ability as human beings to interpret our experiences and represent them to ourselves. We can, and do, construct theories about ourselves and our world. Moreover, we act on these theories. In failing to recognize this, positivism is said to ignore the world in which the meanings are developed by active subjects through their life experiences. The findings of positivistic social science are often said to be of little consequence to those for whom they are intended, namely teachers, social workers, counselors, personnel managers, and the like. The more effort, it seems, the researchers put into their scientific experimentation in the laboratory by restricting, simplifying, and controlling variables, the more likely they are to end up with a pruned, synthetic, and constructed version of the whole social reality. The limitations mentioned above are quite serious, but what alternatives have been shaped out to cope with these limitations? This is what is going to be outlined next. 3.4.3 Alternative Approaches to Development of Social Science Inquiry. The perspective of the researcher to view reality and visualize appropriate modes of inquiry through which it can be observed, studied, and understood is heavily dependent on the ideological position one holds about these basic concepts and processes. This fact is at the root of the evolution of different methods of research and methodological emphases. The anti-positivist movement in different disciplines of the social sciences is represented by three schools of thought: phenomenology, ethnomethodology, and symbolic interactionism. A common thread running through the three schools is a concern with phenomena. That is, the things we directly apprehend through our senses as we go about our daily lives, together with a consequent emphasis on qualitative as opposed to quantitative methodology. Phenomenology. In its broadest meaning, phenomenology is a theoretical point of view that advocates the study of direct experience taken at face value. It sees behavior as determined by the phenomena of experience, rather than by external objective and physically described reality. E. Husserl and A. Schutz are the main proponents of this school of thought. The distinguishing features of this viewpoint are a belief in the importance and in the primacy of subjective consciousness, an understanding of consciousness as active, as meaning-bestowing, a claim that there are certain essential structures to consciousness of which we gain direct knowledge by a certain kind of reflection. Exactly what these structures are is a point about which phenomenologists differ. The phenomenologists believe that any phenomenon obtains because it is experienced. The experience provides meaningfulness to the phenomenon. The experience of individuals involved is thus an essential and integral part of the phenomenon. It is for this reason that the social phenomena, unlike natural phenomena, have an important component in human experience. The inclusion of this constituent of human experience in the social phenomena makes them very different from natural phenomena. The process of experiencing involves the interaction between social environment and the individual. During such interaction, another significant process comes into play, namely interpretation, through which meanings to different actions or ideas are attached and the experience constructed. It is this meaningfulness arrived at through defining and interpreting that makes the phenomenon a reality. Getting to know the process of interpretation by individuals requires the researcher to develop empathic understanding. It is through this ability that the researcher can reproduce in his mind feelings, motives, and thoughts that are behind the actions of others. This requires a researcher to view the other person's behavior from the point of view of that reason. To a phenomenologist, the situation under study is essentially unstructured, to which he has to give meanings through symbolic interaction and interpretation. In this process, an individual's own consciousness plays an important role in comprehending the situation. Relevant information, his perceptions of different elements in the situation, and a synthesized view of the situation are utilized to arrive at perceiving symbolically meaningful objects which aid the process of understanding the situation. This demands taking into consideration the reaction of the individual, treating him as a person, and also knowing the perspective he holds to view different elements of the situation for creating symbolically meaningful structures. Processing the situation data thus obtained leads to a gradual comprehension of it in the total context of the experience. In fact, this emphasis on experience and thus on experience's feelings and motives makes objectification of data rather difficult and also unnecessary, since some relevant aspects of it are likely to be lost in the attempt of objectifying. It necessitates identifying and discerning the inner world of the individuals for understanding any phenomenon in the social environment. The essential structure of a social phenomenon, which involves social organization, social relationships, belief systems, value orientations, the resultant interactional patterns, refers to those elements which make the phenomenon. An individual's experience is an integral part of these elements. Also, the whole phenomenon is temporal and contextual. Any description of a social phenomenon made at a time and in a given context of the larger social system cannot be considered valid across varied conditions along the time dimension. Thus, the outcomes of pursuits of research with this perspective cannot be taken for generalizations in the form of context-free or universal explanations. Moreover, it necessitates the need of reconstructing continuously what has been already studied, understood, and described adequately. This feature of knowledge generation regarding social phenomena may throw light on the nature of knowledge and its structures in social sciences, and makes it distinct from the body of knowledge in natural sciences. Ethnomethodology. Like phenomenology, it is concerned with the world of everyday life. According to its proponent, Harold Garfinkel, it sets out to treat practical activities, practical circumstances, and practical sociological reasoning as topics of empirical study, and by paying the most commonplace activities of daily life the attention usually accorded to extraordinary events, seeks to learn about them as phenomena in their own right. He maintains that the students of a social world must doubt the reality of that world, and that in failing to view human behavior more skeptically, social scientists have created an ordered social reality that bears little relationship to the real thing. Ethnomethodology, thus, is concerned with how people make sense of their everyday world. More especially, it is directed at the mechanisms by which participants achieve and sustain interaction in a social encounter, the assumptions they make, the conventions they utilize, and the practices they adopt. Ethnomethodology, then, seeks to understand social accomplishments in their own terms. It is concerned to understand them from within. In identifying the taken-for-granted assumptions characterizing any social situation and the ways in which the people involved make their activities rationally accountable, ethnomethodologists use notions like indexicality and reflexivity. The former refers to the ways in which actions and statements are related to the social contexts producing them, while the latter refers to the way in which all accounts of social settings, descriptions, analyses, criticisms, etc., and the social settings occasioning them are mutually interdependent. Symbolic interactionism. The notion of symbolic interactionism essentially derives from the work of G.H. Mead. The noted researchers such as Bloomer, Hughes, Becker, and Goffman were subsequently associated with this school of thought. It is possible to identify the following three postulates of this viewpoint. First, human beings act towards things on the basis of the meanings they have for them. Humans inhabit two different worlds. The natural world, wherein they are organisms of drives and instincts, and where the external world exists independently of them, and the social world, where the existence of symbols like language enables them to give meaning to objects. This attribution of meanings, this interpreting, is what makes subjective meanings and the symbols by which they are produced and represented. This means not making any prior assumptions about what is going on in an institution, and taking seriously, indeed giving priority to, inmates' own accounts. Second, this attribution of meaning to objects through symbols is a continuous process. Action is not simply a consequence of psychological attributes such as drives, attitudes, or personalities, or determined by external social facts such as social structure or roles, but results from a continuous process of meaning attribution, which is always emerging in a state of flux and subject to change. The individual constructs, modifies, pieces together, and weighs up the pros and cons and bargains. Third, this process takes place in a social context. Individuals align their actions to those of others. They do this by taking the role of the other, by making indications to themselves about others' likely responses. They construct how others wish or might act in certain circumstances, and how they themselves might act. They might try to manage the impressions others have of them, put on a performance, try to influence others' definition of the situation. Instead of focusing on the individual and his or her personality characteristics or on how the social structure or social situation causes individual behavior, symbolic interactionists direct their attention at the nature of interaction, the dynamic activities taking place between people. In focusing on the interaction itself as a unit of study, the symbolic interactionist creates a more active image of the human being and rejects the image of the passive, determined organism. Individuals interact. Societies are made up of interacting individuals. People are constantly undergoing change in interaction, and society is changing through interaction. Interaction implies human beings acting in relation to each other, taking each other into account, acting, perceiving, interpreting, acting in relation to each other, acting again. Hence, a more dynamic and active human being emerges, rather than an action merely responding to others. A critical overview of the approaches. For the purpose of this overview, we term the phenomenological, ethno-methodological, and symbolic interactionist perspectives commonly as the phenomenological perspective or approach, and make the following observations. A. The way in which reality is perceived in social situations with the phenomenological perspective is an artifact, a construction of all the participants of a social situation which, however permanent it may appear to be, may be redefined and therefore changed. It is assumed that the human mind has an inherent capacity to define reality and interpret it, and therefore understand and describe it with related reference and contexts in which it operates. If it is further assumed, which many researchers do, that the whole process of defining reality in its deep context can be examined by another technical and willing person, and assuming still further that the two could have identical or similar orientations in perceiving reality, they are likely to arrive at similar conclusions. The strength of the argument lies in that even if they do not arrive at similar conclusions, this suggests some way to judge the validity of the approach. B. If the position of the phenomenological perspective and the contribution of the approach to the process of knowledge generation are examined, one notices some ambiguity as an alternative approach to what positivists have suggested. The emphasis on the involvement of the observer and his perceptions leaves the whole process of research and its outcomes transitory. The process through which the individual observer may form his perceptions and even define the reality and understand it leaves scope for giving emphasis up to some degree to certain views or feelings and ideas that may be dear to him. In fact, this is an essential feature of the phenomenological approaches. This may allow not only the scope for utilization of ideas and concepts in defining and understanding in a detached manner, but may also get reflected in the very understanding and description of the reality. For instance, how equality of opportunity is defined and described in a social context cannot be free from one's view about certain matters which are of paramount importance socially, and can lead to very varied conclusions depending upon how he utilizes his views for fixing the social parameters and develops the logical process to define it. At times, it may even run the risk of giving ventilation to the researcher's slanted views, even if he is a man of integrity, because the cognitive process in him is not free from what he holds about a social situation and what he thinks others do about the same situation. C. The foregoing observations about phenomenological approaches in general highlight mainly 2 points. 1. These approaches emerged mainly as a strong reaction to the positivist approach of using the paradigm of natural sciences in social sciences. There is a powerful appeal in their argumentation in discarding the positivist scientific method as inadequate and inappropriate to understand social phenomena. While phenomenologists can be legitimately credited with highlighting some very essential aspects regarding reality and the process of describing it, a very perceptive mind in a researcher may easily find the points at which they are ambiguous, vague, and less convincing as far as the adequacy of the approach to contribute to the process of knowledge generation is concerned. 2. The approaches advocated by the positivists and phenomenologists are based on very conflicting premises, and no doubt, each one holds some promise in the pursuit of knowledge generation. However, their inadequacies should suggest the scope for further thinking and continued search for new paradigms or modified ones to serve as more adequate tools of research.
3.6 Emergence of Field Methods. Earlier, we have outlined 2 broad approaches to research. The first, based on the scientific, positivistic paradigm, rests on the creation of theoretical frameworks that can be tested by experimentation, replication, and refinement. Against this scientific, experimental approach, we have outlined an alternative perspective, which has been described as interpretive and subjective, a focus we hasten to add that should be seen as complementing rather than competing with the experimental stance. In this section, our presentation emphasizes the interpretive, subjective dimensions of counseling and family therapy practice and research that are best explored by the case study method, projective technique, and anecdotal records method. Emergence of these methods, which may be considered as field methods, is thus a fallout of the acceptance of interpretive approaches in social science research. Since the scope of controlled experiment is very limited in social sciences, the use of natural experimentation or field methods is the most reasonable way out. Under these methods, the researcher has to make a field study or survey in order to collect research materials or data. The phenomenon is empirically studied and examined, and a conclusion is finally arrived at regarding the cause and effect of the phenomenon. Obviously, all these methods are based on observation. Consequently, field method is a somewhat open-ended term that concerns not only techniques, but also methodology and research procedure. The various elements involved might be defined as follows. General methodology concerns the systematic and logical study of the general principles guiding an investigation. Research strategy or research procedure refers to the way a particular investigation is designed and carried out. Research technique is a particular fact-finding manipulative operation that is used to yield social data. These 3 distinct aspects of field method are brought together in the research process as they are intertwined with each other in the course of any social investigation. Field method is not an exclusive method in the same sense as, say, experimentation is. Field methods are more like an umbrella of activities beneath which any technique of research may be used for gaining the desired information regarding the investigation. 3.6.1 Case Study Method. Case study can be defined as an in-depth study which is concerned with pertinent aspects of a particular unit or situation. The unit under study may be an individual, a social institution, or an agency such as a family, a library, a school, a college, or a rural village, etc. The case to be studied may be some phase of the life history of the unit of attention, or it may represent the entire life history or total functioning of the individual unit. Thus, the case study method involves the collection and recording of data about a case. The collection of data on site is termed as fieldwork, and it involves A. Generally, participant or non-participant observation and interviewing. B. Probably the collection of documentary evidence and descriptive data, and even the administration of tests or questionnaires. And C. Possibly the use of photography, motion pictures, or videotape recording. Thus, whatever the problem or the approach, at the heart of every case study lies a method of observation, participant or non-participant. In participant observation, observers engage in the very activities they set out to observe. Often their cover is so complete that as far as the other participants are concerned, they are simply one of the group. To have better insight into the life of a gang of juvenile delinquents, going to live with them for an extended period of time is a good example of participant observation. Non-participant observers, on the other hand, stand aloof from the group activities they are investigating. The best illustration of the non-participant observer role is perhaps the case of the researcher sitting at the back of a classroom, coding up every 3 seconds the verbal exchanges between the teacher and the pupils by means of a structured set of observational categories. The critics of participant observation as applied to case study or any other field method point out that observers may lose their perspective and become blind to the peculiarities that they are engaged to be investigating. These criticisms raise questions about two types of validity in observation-based research. In effect, comments about the subjective and idiosyncratic nature of the participant observation study are to do with its external validity. How do we know that the results of this one piece of research are applicable to other situations? Fears that observers' judgment will be affected by their close involvement in the group relate to the internal validity of the method. How do we know the results of this one piece of research represent the real thing, the genuine? Many counseling and family therapy situations or problems involve such a complex interaction of variables that there seems to be an urgent need for analyses based on close observation. Case study method may be seen as a response to this need for a return to close natural observation, or as a reaction against the positivist epistemology implied in the psychostatistical paradigm. Case study methods are often described as naturalistic, qualitative, descriptive, responsive and interpretative or ideographic by way of contrast to the abstracted quantitative approach of psychostatistical methods that strip observation to indices. 3.6.2 Projective Techniques. Projective techniques are used to probe areas that cannot be reached easily by other means, or areas in which direct questions are apt to elicit distorted data. Instead of asking a subject for specific information, an investigator has to interpret or respond freely to ambiguous stimuli, such as ink blots, pictures, unfinished sentences, word associations, or lifelike dramatic roles. Each of the above-mentioned types of stimuli has given rise to a particular type of projective test or technique, such as thematic apperception test, Rorschach ink blot test, word association test, etc. Through self-structured, spontaneous responses, the subject unconsciously reveals manifestations of their personality characteristics and organization. Only highly trained workers can interpret the implications of these responses, and scoring them is laborious. Projective tests are difficult to validate, and many of the tools have not been standardized. Some weaknesses in them are being overcome, but much work remains to be done. 3.6.3 Anecdotal Records. In order to have better insight into certain unusual aspects of emotional and social behavior, anecdotal records may be kept in a cumulative way. For instance, anecdotal materials have come to be a significant part of evaluation and counseling activities in schools. A type of cumulative individual record which emphasizes episodes of behavior important in the development of character or personality is known as an anecdotal behavior journal. These anecdotes include not only maladjustment, but also positive and constructive episodes, the admirable behavior of well-adjusted children, and the outstanding accomplishments of the superior or talented. The anecdote, as a revealing episode of conduct, is in the form of a word picture or verbal snapshots. To be most helpful, anecdotes should possess the characteristics of objectivity, factual emphasis, clarity, and subjectivity, in the sense that an artistically composed photograph is subjective, with a center of attention and with subordination of inconsequential details. Anecdotal records serve useful purposes by way of mutual understanding between teachers and pupils, counseling relationships, appraisal of learning outcomes, and case instructions in professional programs. 3.7. Let us sum up. In this unit, we have understood that there are several means of generating and acquiring knowledge, viz. Experiences, authority, customs, and traditions. We have noted that all these means have developed historically over time, and each one has its own limitations as a source of generating knowledge. We have also seen that the scientific method combines inductive and deductive methods of reasoning, and hence its efficacy as a means of acquiring knowledge. The content of this unit includes the impact of knowledge generation through the scientific approach, which ultimately opened up different newer fields of study. In reaction to the positivistic paradigm, non-positivistic approaches gradually made their presence felt in social sciences. Mcft 3.8 Glossary. Case study method. An in-depth study which is concerned with pertinent aspects of a particular unit or situation. Epistemology. Theory of knowledge. Syllogism. A thinking process in which one proceeds from general to specific statements by deductive thinking.